Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going deep, really deep, into something that might sound a little dry at first, but stick with us. We're talking about the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code of India.
Yeah, this isn't just some legal mumbo-jumbo that only specialists care about, you know?
Right. This code, it actually impacts all of us.
Yeah.
Whether you're a lawyer, a law student, or just someone trying to understand how business works in India.
Absolutely.
And we've got a ton of source material here, the actual code itself, commentaries, case studies.
The whole shebang.
So we're going to break it all down,
Yeah.
try to make sense of it all, and hopefully by the end of this deep dive, you'll feel a lot more informed.
Yeah, the goal is to help you actually understand this stuff, not just get lost in the legal jargon.
Okay, so let's start with the basics then. Who does this code actually apply to?
Well, the scope of this code is pretty broad. It covers a lot of different entities. We're talking companies, of course. Companies incorporated under the Companies Act of 2013, sure. But also even older companies, those incorporated under previous laws. And then you've got companies that operate under special acts as long as those acts don't directly conflict with the code.
So it's a pretty big chunk of the corporate world already,
Yeah.
right? But what about other kinds of business structures? Like, are we just talking about companies here?
Nope, it goes beyond that. Limited liability partnerships, or LLPs, they're in there too, along with other entities that are specifically laid out by the Indian central government.
Okay, so it's getting even broader now.
And here's the real kicker. It even covers partnership firms and individuals.
Wait, hold on. Individuals. So like regular people, not just companies, can fall under this code.
Exactly.
Wow, so this really could affect almost anyone dealing with money and business in India.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay, so that brings us to the next big question, I guess. What actually triggers this whole process? What makes the code come into play?
It all boils down to something called default.
Default, okay.
Basically, it means not paying a debt when it's due.
Simple enough. So if I miss a credit card payment, that's a default?
Could be, yeah. It can be the whole amount, part of it, even just missing an installment payment.
Got it. So any kind of debt then? Like
Right.
if I borrow some money from a friend and forget to pay back, does that mean this whole big legal process gets started?
Not quite. The code gets a bit more specific.
Okay.
It differentiates between two main types of debt. You've got financial debt and operational debt.
Right. So what's the difference between those two?
Financial debt, that's kind of what people typically think of when they hear debt. It's basically money that's been dispersed primarily for the time value of money. Think loans, debentures, bonds, those sorts of things.
So like if I took out a loan to start my own business, that would be financial debt.
Yep, exactly.
Okay. And then what about operational debt?
Operational debt, that arises from the day-to-day running of a business. So it includes things like unpaid invoices, for goods or services that you've provided, or like employee salaries, rent for your office space, those kinds of things.
So it's more about those ongoing costs of keeping a business up and running.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. So either of those, if not paid, can actually trigger this whole code into action.
Right.
So it's getting serious now. All right, so let's say someone does default on a debt. Who all gets involved in this whole process? Is it just the debtor and the person they owe the money to?
Well, there's a bit more to it than that.
Okay.
You have your debtor, of course, the person who owes the money, and then you have your creditor, the one who is owed the money.
Okay.
But it's not quite that simple, really. There are actually different types of creditors, you see. You've got financial creditors, those are the ones we've already been talking about, like the folks lending money.
Right.
And then there are operational creditors, the ones who are owed money for goods and services, like we just discussed.
Got it.
And then on top of that, you've also got secured creditors and unsecured creditors.
That's right. Secured and unsecured. What's the difference there again?
Think of it this way. A secured creditor is someone who has some sort of, security in case the debtor can't pay up. They've got something called a security interest.
Okay.
So, for example, imagine you took out a loan to buy a house.
Right.
The bank, in that case, would be a secured creditor because they could seize your house if you default on the loan. That house is their security.
Ah, okay. So it's like having collateral, something to back up the loan.
Exactly. It gives them a way to recover some of their money if things go south.
And unsecured creditors, they don't have that kind of backup.
Nope. They're basically relying entirely on the debtor's promise to pay.
So if I just lend money to a friend with no written agreement or anything, I'd be an unsecured creditor.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so that's the debtor and the different types of creditors. But You mentioned there are other people involved, too.
Yeah, there's this crucial role called the insolvency professional.
Okay, so who are they?
Basically, they're qualified individuals, registered with the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India or IABI. They're kind of like the neutral party in this whole process.
So they're making sure everything's fair and by the book.
Yeah, exactly. And their specific role can actually change depending on what stage the process is in. At the very beginning, you might have an interim resolution professional. They just kind of step in initially to manage things.
Okay.
But then if things move on to like a full-on resolution or liquidation, a resolution professional takes over.
So they're kind of like the experts who come in and try to sort everything out.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay, and then there's this committee of creditors, right? The COAZ, I think I've heard it called. Who are they and what do they do?
The COSI, they're kind of a big deal, yeah. It's basically a committee made up of all the financial creditors.
Oh, okay.
And they get to have a pretty big say in how things move forward, especially when it comes to deciding whether to accept a plan to rescue the debtor or not.
So they have a lot of power in this whole process.
They do, yeah. They're the ones with the most to lose, potentially, so their opinions carry a lot of weight.
Okay, so that's the debtor, the different types of creditors, the insolvency professional, the committee of creditors, anyone else we need to know about.
Oh, yeah, one more, the adjudicating authority. It's a mouthful, I know.
I was going to say.
Basically, it's the court or tribunal that has the final say in the legal decisions.
Makes sense. So which court is it?
Yeah.
Depends on the case.
Yeah, for companies, it's the National Company Law Tribunal, or NCLT, and for individuals, it's the Debt Recovery Tribunal.
Got it. So we've got all our players on the field now, I guess.
Yeah.
It's definitely getting more complex, but I'm starting to see how it all fits together.
It is a bit like a puzzle, yeah.
So let's say a company does default on a debt, and this whole process gets kicked off. What happens next? Is it straight to bankruptcy court?
Actually, one of the main goals of this whole code is to see if the company can actually be saved, before resorting to bankruptcy.
Oh, okay.
And that's where this thing called the Corporate Insolvency Resolution Process, or CRP, comes in.
The CRP. So there's an attempt to actually fix the problem, not just declare the company dead in the water.
Exactly. The CRP is designed to give struggling companies a chance to get back on their feet. It's kind of like a structured lifeline for them.
Okay, so how does that work? What actually happens during this CRP?
It's a pretty involved process, but essentially it lasts for 180 days usually, though it can be extended by another 90 days if the committee of creditors agrees to it.
All right, so there's a bit of time to work things out.
Yeah, during that time, the resolution professional really steps in and takes charge. They're the ones digging into the company's finances, trying to figure out what went wrong, and working out a plan to get things back on track.
So they're kind of like a temporary CEO with a mission to rescue the company.
That's a great way to think about it, and there are a lot of different approaches they might take, It could involve restructuring debts, or maybe bringing in new investors, or even selling off some assets to free up some cash.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. Really depends on the company and the situation.
Exactly. But one thing that's really important during the CRP is something called a moratorium.
A moratorium? What's that?
It's basically like a protective shield for the company.
Oh, okay.
So once the CRP starts, creditors can't take any legal action against the company for a set period of time.
So it gives them some breathing room to focus on actually fixing things without constantly being hounded by lawsuits and debt collectors.
Exactly. It's crucial, really. Otherwise, creditors might just rush to grab whatever assets they can, and that would make it pretty much impossible to actually rescue the company.
Yeah, that makes sense. So this moratorium gives the company a fighting chance to get back on its feet.
Right. It's really a key element of the CRP. Shows how this code is really focused on finding a resolution, not just jumping straight to liquidation.
Okay, so we've got the CRP in motion. The resolution professional is busy working on a plan. The moratorium is in place. What happens next?
Well, at this point, all the creditors have to submit their claims to the resolution professional.
Their claims.
Yeah, basically how much they're owed. And the resolution professional verifies those claims, makes sure everything is accurate. And remember, this is different now. Creditors can't just go after the company individually anymore.
Oh, right. So it's the more collective effort now.
Exactly. The resolution professional needs to get a clear picture of how much everyone is owed. And that information is going to feed into the plan for reviving the company.
That makes sense. Any plan to save the company is going to have to address those debts, right? But who actually gets to decide if the plan is good enough?
That's where the committee of creditors, the COPUNI, they come back in. Remember, they're the ones who have potentially the most to lose if the company goes under.
Right, so they have a real interest in making sure the plan is solid.
Exactly. And the resolution professional can't just implement any plan they come up with. They need the co-P to approve it, and that requires a 75% majority vote.
So it's a pretty democratic process.
It is. They weigh the different options, try to figure out what's best for everyone involved, especially the financial creditors.
Okay.
And once they've approved a plan, it gets submitted to the NCLT for the final stamp of approval.
So there are checks and balances to make sure everything is legally and financially sound.
Yeah.
But what happens once the NCLT approves the plan?
Well, then it becomes legally binding on everyone, the debtor, the creditors, everybody. It's basically a roadmap for how the company is going to get back on track and pay off its debts.
So the CRP is a pretty big deal, a real chance for a struggling company to make a fresh start.
It is, but of course, sometimes things don't work out.
Right.
And that's when we have to talk about the L word, liquidation.
Liquidation. Okay, so that sounds pretty ominous. Is that basically the end of the road for a company?
Yeah, unfortunately it is. It's like the last resort when all other options have been exhausted.
So what exactly happens during liquidation?
Well, a liquidator is appointed, and their main job is to sell off the company's assets. And then the money from those sales is used to pay back the creditors.
Kind of like a fire sale, I guess?
In a way, yeah. But it's important to remember that this is all done according to a very specific and fair process laid out in the code.
Okay, so even in this kind of worst-case scenario, there are still rules in place to make sure it's all done properly.
Absolutely. The liquidator has to follow these strict guidelines to ensure that the sale of assets is transparent and that creditors are repaid in a very specific order of priority.
So there's a hierarchy for who gets paid first then?
Yeah, secured creditors are at the top of the list, as you might expect. They had that collateral, remember, so they get priority. Then come the unsecured creditors and then any other stakeholders.
So there's a system in place to ensure that even though the company itself is gone, everyone involved is treated fairly.
Exactly. And it's important to understand what actually leads to liquidation, too. Like, if no resolution plan can be agreed upon within the CRP timeframe, that can trigger it. Or, if the COCO or the NCLT rejects the proposed plan, that's another way it can happen.
So there are a few different points where the process might shift towards liquidation.
Yeah, and there's one more scenario. If the company actually violates the terms of the approved resolution plan, that can also lead to liquidation.
So there are consequences for not following the plan. There's accountability built into the system.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the things that makes this code so effective. It tries to strike this balance between giving companies a real chance to recover and also ensuring that everything is fair for everyone involved.
It sounds like a really comprehensive approach. So we've been talking a lot about companies, but this code applies to individuals too, right? What happens when an individual can't pay their debts?
That's right. It's not just about companies. The code recognizes that individuals can face financial distress too, and there's a framework in place to help address those situations.
Okay, so is the process for individuals similar to what we've been discussing for companies?
There are definitely some similarities, but also some key differences. Want to dive into that?
Absolutely. I think our listeners would definitely want to hear more about that. Let's explore the world of individual insolvency.
So we've looked at how the code works for companies in distress, but what about individuals? You might be surprised to learn that there are specific provisions in the code for individual insolvency.
Yeah, I am curious how that works. Is it basically a smaller version of the CIP that we talked about for companies?
You could think of it that way. The code offers two main options for individuals: the Fresh Start process and bankruptcy. The Fresh Start process is for individuals with smaller debts.
Smaller debts, meaning?
Currently, the limit is up to INR 10 lakhs.
So it's designed for those who are maybe not drowning in debt, but definitely struggling.
Right. It's all about giving those debtors a chance to kind of reset their finances, get that fresh start. Those who genuinely need it, of course.
Right. Makes sense. It wouldn't be fair if it was a loophole for wealthy folks to just get out of paying their debts. So what are the requirements for someone to qualify for this Fresh Start process? You mentioned the debt limit.
Yeah, so there's the debt limit, and then there are also some income and asset thresholds. Make sure that the process is really meant for those who are truly in need.
So it's not just anyone who can say, oh, I want a fresh start.
Exactly. But okay, let's say someone meets those requirements. What happens next? Well, just like with the CRAP for companies, a moratorium kicks in.
Ah, so that protective shield we talked about, that applies to individuals too.
It does. It means creditors can't take any legal action against the debtor while this process is going on.
That must be a huge relief for someone who's already dealing with the stress of debt.
Absolutely. It gives them a chance to catch their breath and work with a resolution professional to develop a repayment plan.
So there's still professional guidance involved.
Yeah, of course. The resolution professional looks at the person's whole financial situation, their income, their expenses, all of that, and tries to come up with a plan that is actually realistic and achievable.
Okay, and then what? Does this plan just magically happen?
Not quite. That plan gets submitted to the adjudicating authority for approval. For individuals, that's the Debt Recovery Tribunal.
Okay, so there's still a legal process, someone overseeing everything to make sure it's all by the book. So what happens if the Debt Recovery Tribunal approves the plan?
If the plan gets the thumbs up, then the debtor actually gets a discharge from those qualifying debts.
Wow, so it really is a fresh start, like a clean slate.
It is. But of course, not every individual's debt situation fits neatly into that fresh start process. What about those who have larger debts?
Right, the ones that exceed that threshold for the fresh start, what happens to them?
Well, in those cases, the code has provisions for bankruptcy.
Yeah.
And as you can imagine, it's a more, well, serious process.
So this is the next level up then for dealing with debt.
You could say that. For bankruptcy, the process is initiated with an application to the Debt Recovery Tribunal.
Okay, and who can file that application? Is it just the debtor themselves or?
Either the debtor or a creditor can actually file the application.
Oh, so either side can get the ball rolling. Okay, so what happens once the application is in?
The Debt Recovery Tribunal reviews everything, and if they accept the application, then a bankruptcy order is issued. And that's when things really get going. A bankruptcy trustee is appointed.
Okay.
And that trustee, their job is to take control of the debtor's assets.
So it's kind of similar to the liquidator we talked about for companies.
Exactly. They're basically in charge now. The bankruptcy trustee's job is to gather all the assets, evaluate them, and figure out how to liquidate them to get some funds to repay the creditors.
It sounds pretty intense.
Can be, yeah, but it's a structured process. The code lays out these steps to make sure everything is handled in an orderly way, even though, of course, it's a tough situation for everyone involved.
Yeah, for sure. So how does that part work, the actually paying back the creditors? I mean, is it just a free-for-all, or are there rules about that too?
No, there are very specific rules. Just like in corporate liquidation, there's a clear order of priority for how the proceeds from the sale of assets are distributed.
Okay, so who comes first in line?
Secured creditors, just like before. Then the unsecured creditors get their share, and then any other stakeholders.
So even though it's a pretty drastic step, bankruptcy, there's still a system in place to make sure that everything's done fairly and according to the law.
Right. And it's not just individuals that fall under this part of the code. There are also provisions for partnership firms that are facing financial distress.
Oh, right, partnerships. We haven't really touched on those yet. How does the code handle insolvency when it comes to partnerships?
It's similar to individual insolvency, but with partnerships, you have to consider all the partners, right? So it can get a bit more complicated.
Yeah, I can imagine that having multiple partners involved brings in a whole other layer of complexity.
Exactly. For example, let's say one partner wants to initiate insolvency proceedings for the whole partnership. Well, they usually need the agreement of the majority of the partners to do that.
Oh, so it's not just one partner making that decision for everyone.
Right. It's got to be a more collective decision.
Yeah.
And then when it comes to the bankruptcy process itself, you have to look at both the partnership assets and the individual assets of the partners.
So it's not just like you lump everything together and call it a day.
Nope, definitely not. There are specific rules for how all of that is handled, and it can get pretty complex. That's why, if you're dealing with partnership insolvency, it's really important to get expert legal advice.
Yeah, makes sense. It sounds like there are a lot of nuances and specific provisions of the code that you need to be aware of. So wow, we've covered a lot of ground here. Companies, individuals, partnerships. It's clear this insolvency and bankruptcy code in India, it really casts a wide net.
It does, and it shows how important it is to have a system in place to address financial distress, no matter who's experiencing it.
Right, it affects everyone.
And the code, it's designed to bring some order and fairness to these situations, to give both debtors and creditors a way to move forward.
Right, it's not just about punishing people who owe money.
Exactly. The focus is on finding solutions, whether that's rescuing a viable business or helping an individual restructure their debts and get a fresh start.
This has been super informative. It's definitely shed some light on a topic that I think can feel pretty intimidating and complex for a lot of people.
Yeah, for sure. It's not exactly light dinner conversation, but it's important stuff.
It really is. So speaking of real-world applications, what are some of the main takeaways you think our listeners should remember, especially if they're lawyers or law students or anyone involved in business dealings in India?
Well, I'd say the most important thing to remember is that knowledge is power, right? Understanding your financial obligations and really managing your finances responsibly, that can go a long way in preventing you from ever having to deal with this code in the first place.
So prevention is key.
Absolutely. And another big takeaway is that communication is vital. If you find yourself in a situation where you're struggling financially, don't bury your head in the sand, Talk to your creditors, be upfront and honest about your situation.
So have those tough conversations.
Yeah, because a lot of times you can actually work things out without having to go through the whole formal insolvency process.
Makes sense.
And finally, don't be afraid to get professional help when you need it.
Right.
Whether you're a debtor or a creditor, this code can be pretty tricky to navigate on your own.
So having a good team, like insolvency professionals, lawyers, financial advisors, those folks can be really valuable.
Exactly. They can help you understand your options, protect your interests, and make sure everything is handled properly. And remember, what we've talked about today, it's just an overview.
Right.
The code itself is a huge and complex document, and how it's applied can vary depending on the specifics of each case. It really is. This whole code, it's not just about the legal stuff and the financial maneuvering. It's important to remember that there are real people at the heart of all this.
That's so true. It's easy to get caught up in the technicalities and forget that.
For the debtors, this can be a really tough time, facing the possibility of losing their business, their home, even their financial security. It's a lot to deal with.
Yeah, definitely. It's a good reminder that we're not just talking about abstract concepts here. These are real-life situations with real consequences for people.
And it's not just the debtors who are impacted either. Creditors have their own challenges when they're dealing with insolvency. They might be small business owners themselves, relying on those payments, or individuals who have invested their hard-earned savings.
Right, they're dealing with uncertainty and potential financial losses too.
Exactly. So this whole code, while it's designed to help find resolutions, it really highlights how interconnected we all are, financially speaking, and how one person's financial struggles can have these ripple effects.
It's a complex web, for sure.
It is, and I think that's why it's so important for lawyers, law students, really anyone involved in these processes to really try to understand that human dimension.
I agree. It's about approaching these situations with some empathy and recognizing that there's a lot more going on than just the legal and financial aspects.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I just want to emphasize that this has really just been a starting point. We've only scratched the surface of this whole insolvency and bankruptcy code.
Yeah, it feels like we've opened this door to a whole new world.
That's a good way to put it. And if anyone out there is interested in learning more, I definitely recommend checking out the IBBI website.
Right, that's the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India.
Yeah, their website is a great resource. They've got tons of detailed information about the code, the different provisions, how it's all being implemented.
A treasure trove of legal knowledge.
It really is. And of course, if you ever find yourself in a situation where you need some guidance on this stuff, remember there are professionals out there who can help. Insolvency professionals, lawyers, they can offer expert advice and support.
Absolutely. Don't try to go it alone if you don't have to.
Right. Navigating this whole world can be tricky, but having the right people on your side can make all the difference.
Okay, so as we come to the end of our deep dive into the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code of India, what are some of the most important takeaways you'd like our listeners to remember?
Well, I'd say first and foremost, understanding your financial responsibilities, managing your finances well, that can prevent you from ever having to deal with this code in the first place.
So prevention is always the best strategy.
Absolutely. And then if you do find yourself in a tough spot financially, communication is key. Talk to your creditors, be honest about your situation. Often you can work something out without having to go through the whole formal process.
It's always worth trying to find common ground.
It is. And finally, don't hesitate to get professional help if you need it. This code is complex, and having expert guidance can make a huge difference.
Well said. For our listeners, remember, the more you know about this code, the better equipped you'll be to navigate the financial world.
Keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep exploring.
Those are words to live by. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code of India. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.